The first night of loneliness. That night, when the world outside Atlanta was smothered in thick southern fog and the crickets played their endless, indifferent song, I sat alone in the small apartment that suddenly felt cavernous. My name is Emily Turner, 32 years old, and I never knew the true meaning of emptiness until that moment, when my little girl's laughter no longer echoed off these faded yellow walls. It's strange how silence can hurt more than words. Every single detail stood out sharper and crueler in her absence. The neon pink backpack slouched in a corner, a single ballet slipper abandoned under the coffee table, her favorite stuffed rabbit with a torn ear perched on the windowsill like a sentry that had fallen asleep on duty. I had spent years pretending the world was stable, that my love for Sophie could shield us both from whatever storms might come. But tonight, love was powerless against the cold legality that had taken my daughter from my arms. I turned the lamp down low and wrapped myself in the old plaid blanket that used to cover both of us on movie nights. My hands trembled when I reached for my phone, scrolling endlessly through photos of Sophie. Missing teeth, wild hair, paint-stained fingers, those eyes just like mine. Bright, stubborn, alive. Tears came hot and furious, but even sobbing felt cheap. For the first time, no tiny voice would pat my cheek or whisper, "It's okay, Mommy." The why gnawed at me. Why did Tom and his family win? Why did no one believe my side of the story or see the exhaustion and truth behind my eyes? I could still hear the judge's neutral tone as she read the custody decision, the way Tom avoided my gaze, and how his mother clutched her pearls as if I were some kind of criminal. For years, I'd carried a quiet dignity, hiding every bruise, emotional or otherwise, so Sophie would never have to witness my pain. Tonight, all those silent choices crashed in on me, heavy as the midnight sky. Somewhere in the apartment, the refrigerator hummed. The absurd normalcy felt like a cosmic joke. I paced the hallway, pausing before Sophie's empty bedroom. Sunshine-shaped stickers peeled from the door, reminders that happiness had once lived here. I pressed my forehead to the wood, longing desperately for her warm, sleepy hug, her over-the-shoulder grin. Unable to sleep, I wandered to the window and stared at the city lights, the streets stretching out like veins of possibility or regret. Atlanta had always seemed vibrant, alive. Now, it was just another witness to my isolation. 1,000 worries marched through my mind. Would Sophie think I abandoned her? Did she know how hard I fought? Could love possibly reach her when the law had shut every door between us? That first night wasn't just about the absence of my daughter. It was the death of old certainties, the slow birthing pain of a resolve I didn't know I had. In the deep hush of that lonely midnight, quietly swore this wasn't the end. For Sophie and for myself, I would find a way through the darkness, even if tonight it swallowed me whole. The unspoken injustice, facing a wall of rumors and pointed whispers every single day, became my new normal, and not by choice. It started at work, blended into the supermarket aisles, followed me in the school parking lot, and crept into my social media feeds. Tom, or maybe mostly his family, worked overtime, polishing their perfect victim act, speaking with feigned sadness about how difficult I'd become, how they'd tried everything for poor Sophie. I was cast as the selfish mother, the unreliable one, the storm that wrecked their peace. And the worst part was knowing that their version was all anyone heard. Gossip is a fast-moving poison in small communities. At PTA meetings, former friends would avert their eyes. My neighbors' greetings grew short and stiff, and sometimes Even at my own church, I could feel judgment simmering beneath polite smiles. Online, it was even more clear. Little comments here and vague posts there. Nothing outright malicious, but each one built on the next, until I could almost hear the collective verdict. I was the monster. What haunted me most wasn't the outright lies, but the subtle half-truths, twisted just enough to make me out cold, uncaring, unstable. Tom knew exactly which buttons to push. Stories that blended just enough of my exhaustion as a working mother with sprinkles of misinterpreted moments. They used my every struggle against me. The missed birthday because of a double shift. The time Sophie came home with a skinned knee. My awkward silences at family events. Things real parents would know happened to all of us. Yet, in their telling, I became negligent by design. I wanted to scream out the truth, not for revenge, but for dignity. But every time I started, people only listened to what they expected to hear. A bitter ex-wife, desperate for sympathy or attention. The system itself seemed to echo their doubts. There were days I truly wondered if anyone, even my own family far away in Oregon, believed the woman they knew could survive all this without breaking down or growing bitter. I stayed quiet because I feared any angry outburst would only make their stories more believable. And because, deep down, I still thought truth must surely win if I just held on. Inside, the injustice weighed heavier than the loneliness. I could have left Atlanta. I could have cut my losses and started life over somewhere anonymous. But Sophie was here, and so was my name, which Tom and his family dragged through the mud. I decided I wasn't going to hide. If I would be called selfish, I'd at least be selfish in fighting for justice, for myself and my daughter. Sometimes, pushing back against the tide is the only way to prove you're still alive. Only a faint glimmer of hope left. I suppose there comes a point, after too many sleepless nights, too many days spent moving through the world like a ghost, when a person starts to feel that hope is a privilege reserved for the lucky ones. After the custody loss, my life became a stretch of empty hours, where even breathing felt like work, the kind that didn't pay off. My friends, if you could call them that after everything, had grown scarce, and my family was a flicker on the other side of the country. Their voices over the phone, kind but distant, like some well-meaning chorus in an old radio play. For weeks, I went through the motions at my job at the dental clinic, managed the rent, kept my head down at the grocery store. None of it real, just a pantomime of living. Shame is a strange thing. It seeps into your bones, makes your own reflection seem like an accusation. I remember staring at myself in the mirror before crawling into bed every night, tracing the new lines on my face and the defeat in my eyes. If I had been stronger, smarter, less exhausted, if I bled myself with self-doubt 1,000 times over. The what-ifs became my lullabies. It was Sophie's photo on the mantel that kept me upright. She was 6 in that picture, posed in the sunlight, chocolate ice cream streaking her chin. Her smile was crooked, wild, impossible not to love. That photograph refused to let me surrender entirely. No matter how dark it got, no matter how much the apartment closed in on me, there she was, reminding me that somewhere out there, my daughter still needed me, whether she knew it or not. Most days, I wrestled with the feeling that everyone else, even the system itself, had decided what kind of woman I was. No matter how much I wanted to shout my truth, it felt like the world had already turned its back. When Tom's mother saw me at the market and gave me that pitying little smile, or when I overheard parents at the school whispering about what a shame it was, I clenched my jaw and walked on, pretending I wasn't the villain in their story. I told myself I was doing it for Sophie, that maybe one day, when she was old enough, she'd know what really happened. But late at night, all I wanted was the chance to hold her, to apologize, to say, I never gave up. Not really. I read somewhere that grief is the price we pay for love. Well, if that's true, then hope must be the interest, the thing that keeps growing, quietly, whether we want it or not. In my small hours, when the city was asleep, and the refrigerator hummed its broken lullaby, I let myself imagine another ending. What if I could prove I was telling the truth? What if the right person finally listened? These were the kinds of stubborn thoughts I tried hard to suppress, but they kept flickering back, impossible to extinguish. One evening in June, 3 months since the court order, the rain came down hard and sudden, drumming against my windows with furious insistence. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I found myself pacing the living room, clutching a mug of stale chamomile tea. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. For some reason, instead of ignoring it, I opened the text. It was brief, almost cryptic. You're not alone. The truth will come out, Emily. Don't give up. There was no name attached, just that one little thread. At first, I thought it was someone playing a cruel joke. But as I stared at those words, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was desperation, maybe a spark of my old self. But I decided then and there that I wouldn't let despair finish what Tom and his family had started. I would fight back, even if the odds were laughably small. Maybe I couldn't trust the system to see me, but I could document everything. Each slight, each conversation, every detail they'd twisted or hidden. So I bought a simple notepad, yellow, lined, nothing fancy, and kept it with me everywhere. I wrote down every interaction with Tom and his family, every time Sophie's stories didn't add up when she called, every strange look from their lawyer at drop-off. I started saving emails, taking pictures, quietly asking questions. For the first time in a long while, my hands felt steady, my mind sharp. The world didn't change overnight. I still spent endless hours alone in that apartment, still flinched at every new post on social media, still winced when someone muttered my name. But now, there was a current of purpose beneath the pain, a plan forming, slow and steady, like the roots of a stubborn tree pushing through stone. After a few weeks, I started researching lawyers, good lawyers, the kind who believed in justice, not just the highest bidder. I made a list, crossed off names, gathered recommendations from internet forums, even anonymous support groups of parents like me. Most didn't want to take the case, wary of small-town politics and Tom's family's connections. But I kept trying. Every night, when I was tempted to toss the notepad aside and sink into old grief, I'd open up Sophie's photo on my phone and whisper, "It isn't over yet, baby." Sometimes I'd dream of her, running through dappled sunlight, her laughter echoing, just out of reach. I'd wake up with tears on my pillow, raw and aching, but also grateful for the reminder that what I loved most in the world was worth fighting for. What I hadn't realized, back in those first weeks, was that hope isn't something loud. It doesn't burst through the front door with a trumpet blast. It's soft, persistent, patient. It lingers in the quiet moments, in the space between breaths, in the way your heart stirs, even when you think it can't endure one more disappointment. Looking back, I see how everything began to shift that rainy night. Not with some grand revelation, but with a text message from a stranger and a stubborn refusal to quit. I was still terrified, still bitter at the injustice, but somewhere beneath all that hurt, hope started to grow. Quiet at first, then steadier and steadier, threading its way through the ruins of my old certainties. I wasn't out to destroy Tom or win back public approval anymore. What I wanted was simpler, fiercer, to be a mother to my daughter again, to build a life for the two of us where the truth could finally breathe. And even if the whole world doubted me, judged me, whispered behind my back, I finally knew one thing for sure. If there was even a faint glimmer of hope, that was enough to keep going. Quietly, gathering evidence. My transformation into a detective didn't happen overnight. It was born from survival and that small, stubborn thread of hope. The first time I tucked my notepad into my purse, I felt self-conscious, like I was doing something wrong. But gathering evidence became my silent rebellion, my way of speaking the truth in a world that refused to listen. Each morning, before leaving for work, I took a photo of Sophie's room, just in case I needed timestamps. Every call with Tom was recorded, documented with date, time, and a brief summary of what was said. I kept every email, every text message, every social media post that hinted at his family's manipulation. I learned, through YouTube tutorials and late-night research, how to save backups, how to organize files the way a lawyer might appreciate them someday. At Sophie's visits, I asked careful questions. Did she eat? Did she sleep well? Was she happy? Children have a way of telling the truth in the spaces between words. Sometimes she'd reveal small inconsistencies, details about Tom's schedule, or about something Tom's mother had said. After each call, I'd write it down in my notepad, cross-referencing it with other oddities. The hardest part was staying calm when I wanted to scream. When Tom would forget a scheduled call and later blame it on my difficult behavior, I'd calmly respond by email, always polite, always succinct. I kept the tone professional for a reason. In a world eager to cast me as irrational and unstable, I refused to give them ammunition. Every exchange became a chance to build my case, stone by stone. There were days when paranoia threatened to overwhelm me. I'd double-check doors, review my notes late into the night, terrified that I'd missed something important. Other days, the weight of secrecy made me angrier than I care to admit. It didn't help that I had no one to confide in. The loneliness made each victory, no matter how small, feel both huge and hilariously insufficient. But slowly, things started coming together. Patterns emerged. Tom's stories, so smooth and rehearsed in court, began to fray at the edges when examined with patience. There were receipts that contradicted his sworn statements. There were text exchanges with Sophie that didn't match what he'd reported about her health or happiness. I even noticed times when his family's social media posts suggested Sophie had been left with a sitter, despite them claiming she was always with them. One weekend when Sophie visited, she mentioned her grandmother had left her alone, just for a little bit, while she went to the store. I pressed gently in later conversations, never making Sophie feel scared or in the wrong, but noting each inconsistency. It tore at my heart, knowing she was trapped in the middle of adult games, but I had no choice if I wanted a chance at justice. Some nights, I'd sit at the dining table, surrounded by printouts, notes, and coffee-stained folders, thinking of all the stories I'd heard about mothers losing hope and simply walking away. I swore I wouldn't be one of them. The idea of Sophie growing up believing those lies about me was worse than any loneliness or humiliation. I learned restraint. I never posted rants online, never called out Tom's family by name. Instead, I documented everything. Quiet, persistent, methodical. It was lonely, frustrating, and sometimes thankless. But my resolve didn't waver. If the system wanted more than just instinct and tears, I would give them facts. A mother's love can be fierce, but a mother's preparation can be bulletproof. I kept repeating that to myself, especially on the loneliest nights when the city lights of Atlanta blurred through my tears and the world felt impossibly unfair. Through it all, I found a new kind of strength, not loud or angry, but steady. The strength of someone who has nothing left to lose except the truth. By the time fall crept through Georgia, my folder of evidence was thick and detailed. It might not have been enough yet, but it was more than I'd had before. The backbone of the fight I wouldn't surrender, partnering with a compassionate lawyer. If you've ever found yourself at the lowest point of desperation, lower than you thought you'd ever go, you understand how impossible hope can feel. In those slow, raw days after I began collecting evidence, my thoughts spun endlessly. Would anyone ever believe me? Was it even possible to overturn the court's decision? But something about the steady ritual of documenting my life with Sophie and the lies woven into Tom's stories had reawakened a small, stubborn determination in me. I knew I needed real help if I was going to fight back against Tom's resources and his family's long reach in our community. The search for a sympathetic lawyer was its own private kind of exhaustion. I scoured online legal directories late at night until my contacts list was a graveyard of polite refusals and non-committal responses. Most lawyers didn't want to take on a family so prominent. Others wanted more money than I could reasonably scrape together, even with the small bit my own mother wired from Oregon. There were long, awkward phone calls, somewhere between interviews and humiliations, where I tried to explain myself, my history, why the narrative everyone believed wasn't the truth at all. I got used to hearing, "I'm sorry, but," and "maybe," someone else. Still, the hope that had kept me up for weeks wouldn't let me quit. I started joining online forums for parents who'd lost custody, mostly under pseudonyms. It was there, buried under a comment thread about judicial prejudice, that someone mentioned Rachel Bennett, a family attorney with a small firm just outside of Atlanta. They said she was a no-nonsense, sharp-witted woman who'd once won a case against a local judge's nephew. More than that, she was a single mom herself. That detail, as absurd as it sounds, made me trust her already, a survivor's instinct. If anyone could understand, maybe Rachel could. My first call with Rachel didn't start out like the others. She actually answered herself, her voice brisk and warm. Not the semi-interested receptionist or oblivious case manager I'd grown to dread. I stumbled through my story in a rush, expecting the usual soft letdown. Instead, she interrupted and said, "Emily, do you have documentation? Dates? Anything in writing?" I told her about the notepad, the recordings, the emails. Her tone changed. She said, "Come in tomorrow. Bring it all. We'll talk." Becoming Rachel's client felt like finally finding dry land after months at sea. Rachel's office was nothing like the intimidating glass towers I'd envisioned. Tucked into a sun-faded strip mall, it was modest, cluttered, alive with the scent of coffee and old paper. Her desk spilled over with files, sticky notes, and a framed photo of her teenage daughter beaming in braces. Rachel herself was in her late 30s, with soft curls pinned in a no-nonsense bun, and a gaze that missed nothing. She offered me strong coffee in a chipped mug and motioned to her second chair without ceremony, as if she'd been waiting for me for years. I poured out my story. Again, but this time, something felt different. Rachel just listened, scribbling notes, pausing only to ask the kind of questions that told me she actually knew this battlefield from the inside. "Let's start with what we have, not what we don't," she said crisply after I'd finished. She thumbed through my notepad, scrolled my phone for screenshots, and began to assemble lines and patterns right before my eyes. It was as if she were piecing together a puzzle whose box lid only I had ever seen. Where I saw chaos and shame, Rachel saw leverage and possibility. She made copies of everything and added them to a growing legal folder beside her keyboard. "Emily, this isn't going to be fast or easy," she warned. "But you have more than you think. The court cares about evidence, not just impressions. The key is to establish patterns, timeline inconsistencies, proof of neglect or manipulation, anything that contradicts the sworn statements. We'll need backup, preferably from witnesses. But this is a start." I could have wept with relief. For the first time since losing Sophie, I felt less alone. Rachel wasn't going to coddle me, but she wouldn't let me quit either. She set me up with weekly phone check-ins. She combed my notes for actionable data, assigning me homework, request school records, collect more drop-off screenshots, approach Sophie's teacher for neutral observations. She taught me how to request written documentation for every exchange with Tom, even when he bristled at the formal language. Each week, Rachel and I built my case, brick by brick. She never pretended the law would be on my side just because I was a mother, or just because Tom was, at the very least, manipulative. Her measured realism became a strange source of comfort. The idea that justice might not be inevitable, but it was still possible if we worked smart and relentless. Some days, our meetings were almost all business. On others, especially bad days, she'd slip in stories about her own custody battles, about how the courtroom felt colder than any jail, and how rebuilding trust with her daughter had taken more years than she cared to admit. Little by little, Rachel helped me believe that I had the right to fight for my life with Sophie. She suggested therapy, not just for me, but for Sophie, if and when the courts allowed, or at least for us both when we were finally reunited. She explained how everything in family law hinged on language and perception as much as fact. She coached me on presenting myself truthfully but calmly. Never rant, never attack Tom's family directly, never give their side more ammunition. As the weeks turned to months, she became my general, therapist, and confidant, all rolled into one. We faced setbacks, judges denied motions, Tom's family filed countersuits alleging harassment, and more than once, my own faith wavered under the court's glacial indifference. But Rachel was there for every panic attack, every burst of late-night paranoia, redirecting my attention to what we could control: our narrative, our evidence, our persistence. Thanks to her guidance, I began to gather statements from neighbors and records of Sophie's unexplained absences. With her encouragement, I even wrote a personal letter to the judge. Not a rant, but a meticulous recounting of facts and heartfelt request for fairness, which Rachel edited word by word until it was sharp enough to withstand a hurricane of scrutiny. The process dragged on, as legal wars always do. Rachel prepared me for interrogations, coached me on how to handle Tom's lawyers, who alternated between sneering condescension and shockingly personal attacks. She never promised victory, but she never allowed despair to take over either. And if I ever doubted the point of this endless trench war, she'd remind me, no one regrets fighting one more day for their child. It's the quitting they regret. Our work together changed me. I learned to separate my fear from my identity. I began to recognize my own patterns. When shame crept in, when old anger made me reckless, Rachel would steer me back to the evidence, to what we could prove, not just what we knew in our bones. With each new piece of data, with every contradiction we uncovered, between Tom's affidavits and reality.
Copy that.
My confidence grew, with Rachel as my witness, my champion, my co-strategist. By the time we neared the formal appeal, our legal folder was thick with proof, timelines, character statements, communication logs, and expert insight from a child psychologist Rachel trusted. The narrative was still stacked against me. Reputation is a heavy anchor in the American South. But now, mine was no longer just another battered mother's sob story. It was a case, meticulously built, impossible to ignore. The day we filed our appeal, Rachel poured 2 black coffees and raised her cup. "To resilience and mothers who don't back down," she said, wry and fierce. I smiled, for the first time in what felt like years, and drank. Whatever the outcome, I knew I'd done everything possible, that I was no longer fighting alone. I had Rachel at my side, someone who understood both the law and the tender rage of a mother's love, and that, for the first time in ages, felt enough to tip hope back into my corner. The battle in the courtroom. The morning of my day in court came with a gray, merciless mist crawling against my bedroom window, as if the city itself was bracing for something monumental. I had not slept for more than an hour. My nerves were a tangled mess, fear and anticipation looping through my stomach like twin threads. I stood in front of my apartment's cracked mirror, observing the circles under my eyes, touching the trembling corners of my mouth. Somewhere inside, I wondered if self-doubt would win today, or if that small, defiant kernel of hope would finally take root. Rachel, my attorney, called me before sunrise. "Breathe, Emily," she coaxed. "Let's stick to the facts. We've prepared." Her voice, always a blend of brisk command and hard-won empathy, was just steady enough to keep the panic at bay. I dressed carefully, choosing navy slacks and a soft, clean blouse. No jewelry except my well-worn watch. I needed to look as composed as possible, as if I already belonged in that room, not as a desperate woman, but as a mother fighting for what's just and true. Stepping into the courthouse was like crossing into another world, a world with its own rules, rhythms, an air so stale I could almost taste the years of heartbreak lingering inside. The corridors were lined with tired faces, other mothers, fathers, lawyers, shuffling stacks of files, voices echoing down the fluorescent-lit hallway. My heart thundered. Every step toward the courtroom door felt like wading through thick molasses. Tom and his family arrived as a unit, backs straight, expressions tight and rehearsed. His mother met my eyes, just long enough for me to see the judgment she thought she was hiding. Tom himself hardly looked at me. He was busy conferring with his lawyer, a polished man in a tailored suit, who radiated the confidence of someone used to getting his way. I gripped my notepad so tightly that the spiral edge left imprints on my palm. Rachel gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze, then led our way inside. Courtrooms are nothing like television. They're colder, quieter. The tension is palpable, and yet everything moves at a glacial pace. I took my place at the petitioner's table, arranging my notes and folders precisely as Rachel had shown me. The judge entered, not the woman from our previous hearing, but a new face, graying at the temples, with kind eyes, and a voice that cut through the silence like a bell. Rachel's whisper, fresh perspective, could work in our favor. Opening statements were short. Tom's lawyer painted their family as a sanctuary, stable, loving, pillars of the community. He barely mentioned me, except as a cautionary tale, a woman who, by his vague phrasing, had let stress disrupt the child's routine. That stung, but Rachel had warned me not to react. She leaned in with her legal pad and wrote, "Stay calm," in big block letters. I unclenched my fists beneath the table. Rachel stood next, her presence compact, yet somehow larger than life. She didn't resort to theatrics. She focused on evidence, dates, emails, inconsistencies. Her voice never wavered as she explained why the official story didn't add up. When she referenced my notepad, my meticulously kept log of phone calls and missed visits, I saw the judge's eyebrow arch ever so slightly. For perhaps the first time since all this began, someone in power was really listening. The days in court felt endless, every hour a test of resilience. Tom's family paraded witnesses, neighbors who barely knew me, friends who recited lines about Sophie's supposed instability. When it was my turn, Rachel guided each answer, reminding me, with her gaze, to stay grounded, to return always to facts, not feelings. My nerves vibrated just beneath my skin, but every time doubt threatened, I thought of Sophie and the nights without her, and spoke as clearly as I could. There were moments when I thought I'd break, when Tom's lawyer grilled me on the stand, picking apart old appointments I'd missed. Moments when I stumbled and gave in to exhaustion, and his smile curved like a victory lap. I could feel the eyes of the courtroom on me, measuring every word, every stutter in my voice. But Rachel's cross-examination was relentless. She asked Tom about phone conversations he claimed hadn't happened, produced timestamps and text messages to prove otherwise, and without raising her voice, laid bare every contradiction. Slowly, the cracks formed. A babysitter testified, unintentionally, I think, that she'd been alone with Sophie several times, despite Tom's sworn statement that family was always with her. Sophie's teacher, whom Rachel had secured as a neutral witness, described changes in Sophie, her withdrawn mood, her repeated questions about when she'd go home to mommy. These details, these small, poignant truths, seemed to settle over the court like new evidence of gravity. On the stand, I spoke about routines, the way I'd brush Sophie's hair each night, the lunches I packed with handwritten notes, the special knock we used for good luck. Rachel nodded at these ordinary details, knowing they painted a living, breathing portrait of motherhood, not the flat accusation Tom's team offered. I admitted my mistakes, too, confessing to the time I showed up late for a school play, or the birthday I had to reschedule due to work. The courtroom quieted. No grand speech, just my faltering honesty. Somewhere in the long hours, I realized how much was at stake. Not just a verdict, but my own sense of self. Court strips away pretense, leaving you exposed, raw. My voice shook as I described the pain of those first nights without Sophie. The bathroom door I locked so she wouldn't hear me cry after each confrontation with Tom. The holidays spent alone amid her drawings, taped to my fridge. But I also spoke about resolve, how hope, stubborn as it was, had kept me from vanishing completely. The evidence Rachel had painstakingly assembled became the beating heart of our case. We presented call logs, medical records from times Tom's stories didn't match up, and school attendance sheets showing discrepancies in Sophie's routine. Rachel's cross-referencing was methodical. She lined up timelines and gently exposed every place where Tom's version unraveled. At one point, she placed two photos side by side for the judge. One of Sophie with me, beaming and messy-haired. Another, taken recently in Tom's home, her eyes puffy, her smile absent. Short but devastating comparison. There were long stretches, late afternoons where the attorneys quibbled over paperwork. When I thought I couldn't take another hour, I scribbled in my notepad, my handwriting devolving into nervous scrawls. I kept glancing at Rachel, who never seemed shaken. She'd slide her legal pad in front of me, a new line in her familiar handwriting. one step at a time. When Tom's lawyer insinuated I was just angry over the divorce, Rachel objected with ice-cold precision and shifted the attention back to evidence. Witness after witness took the stand, but for once, I felt like I was regaining my ground. Some statements didn't seem as damaging as Tom's team believed. In cross-examination, Rachel revealed their contradictions, or their distance from actual events. My own friends came, those who'd stood by even when it would have been easier to disappear. They testified about my devotion to Sophie, the way I'd rearranged my world to keep her close, how the loneliness after she left was like a slow-motion heartbreak. Even my supervisor from the dental office appeared, describing my reliability and the exhaustion that never dimmed my affection for my child. There was tension, always, a precarious balance between hope and fresh humiliation. Some days, the courthouse felt colder, the stairs more pointed. There were evenings I went home angry, stewing over a judge's skeptical glance or Tom's smug half-smile. The process stretched over weeks, with breaks for new evidence, for court recesses that seemed only to draw out the agony. But there was a rumbling undercurrent, the feeling, real and electric, that things were slowly shifting. Eventually, it was time for closing arguments. Tom's attorney spoke first, his words armored in rhetoric. He painted me as unstable, a mother rattled by change, suggesting Sophie needed the calm and stability Tom's family could provide. But the cracks could no longer be papered over. His argument, for all its polish, sounded defensive now, as if he could sense the weather shifting. Then Rachel stood, every ounce of her exhaustion channeling into quiet gravity. She walked the judge through the timeline, gesture by gesture, document by document, testimony by testimony. She never raised her voice, never tried to win by sheer emotion. Instead, she trusted in the story the evidence told, a mother's unwavering presence, the changes in Sophie's demeanor, the contradictions in Tom's account. When she finished, the room felt a little lighter, like everyone for a moment had finally heard the truth. The judge took it all in with deliberate silence. There was no immediate verdict, just a last gaze at the mountain of documents, at Rachel, at Tom's team, and finally, at me. We were dismissed. The waiting that followed was perhaps the longest of my life. Every hour crawled. I replayed testimonies in my mind, worried I had faltered at a crucial moment. I doubted, then hoped. I cycled through guilt, then defiance, over and over as days gave way to another anonymous sunrise. During this time, my relationship with Rachel deepened in unexpected ways. We met not just at her office, but in coffee shops, in the library basement as we pored over filings. Sometimes we sat together in silence. She checked my breathing, reminded me to eat, loaned me books to distract my panic. Her belief in my case was more than professional. It felt, at times, like she was willing me to put myself back together, regardless of the outcome. Once, as I started spiraling over a possible defeat, she slid her hand over mine and said, "Winning isn't just about the verdict, you know. It's how fiercely you chose to show up for love." The days waiting for the verdict turned into a lesson in both vulnerability and resolve. I discovered how strong my own voice had become, how impossible it now felt to just fade quietly into the background. My apartment was still far too quiet, but there was life there, again, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the sacrifices and the pain weren't for nothing. I thought constantly of Sophie, of what I might say to her someday, about fighting for truth, even when no one seems to listen. The case had become something bigger than the struggle between Tom and me. It was also a battle to reclaim and redefine myself. Finally, the call came. The verdict would be announced the next day. I slept little, though for once my jittery nerves buzzed with a strange gratitude. No matter what happened, I had fought as hard and honestly as I knew how. Standing on the courthouse steps that final morning, Rachel at my side, I blinked against the pale sunlight and promised myself this was not the end of the story. Whatever the outcome, I would keep seeking the light. Inside, as the courtroom filled and the air thickened with anticipation, I squeezed Rachel's hand beneath the table. The judge entered, his gaze impassive but now familiar. The clerk handed over the ruling, and for one suspended moment, the whole room seemed to stop breathing. When he spoke at last, his voice was calm but unwavering. There is clear and convincing evidence of inconsistencies in the respondent's testimony and omissions relevant to the child's well-being. Custody will be returned to Ms. Turner with immediate effect. Further, the court regrets that its previous decision did not more carefully weigh the evidence now before the bench. I only half heard the rest, the legal language blurred by joy and tears. Rachel's hand tightened around mine. For a heartbeat, the whole brutal road, the loneliness, the fight, the endless doubt, felt justified. I saw Tom's face blanch, his mother collapse, but none of it truly registered. All that mattered was this: my daughter was coming home. Afterwards, it all happened in a rush. Congratulations from people I barely knew. An overwhelmed call to my mother back in Oregon. A bus ride home with Rachel, who, for once, allowed herself a broad smile. The sky outside was impossibly bright. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was free to make plans, to choose Sophie's favorite snack, to pull those old drawings off the fridge and hang them with new pride, to breathe without the weight of accusations on my chest. The scars from the courtroom battle would linger, I knew, but they would also serve as proof of what I was willing to endure, for love, for truth, for my daughter. That night, as I stood alone in my apartment, about to no longer be alone, I gathered fresh pajamas for Sophie and sat on her bed, staring at the peeling sunflower stickers and letting happy tears streak my cheeks. The legal fight had ended, but the story of our hope, our resilience, was just beginning. Honor restored, and a mother's love rekindled. The word victory has always sounded strange to me, like something you read in a book or see in a movie, but never quite believe will step off the page into your own life. Yet that morning, after months, no, years of silent grief and constant struggle, the judge's verdict hung in the air, trembling like sunlight after weeks of rain. I could barely breathe as the clerks finished reading the decision, and my heart kept waiting for someone to take it all back, to wake me up from what surely had to be a cruel, fleeting dream. But they didn't. The courtroom didn't blur out or cave in. Rachel gripped my hand, her own knuckles white with pride and relief, and the judge's final words rang out in my ears. Custody would be returned to me, effective immediately. The gravity of that statement pressed on my chest like a benediction. It felt like standing at the epicenter of an earthquake, everything shifting. Except this time, the world was settling into a kind of rightness I'd never dared to hope for. For a moment, all I could do was bury my face in my hands and let the joy and disbelief spill out unchecked into tears. It turns out, the walk out of a courthouse as a vindicated mother is nothing like the gloomy shuffle you make as someone who's lost everything. Rachel and I practically floated down those sun-struck granite steps. People who had never once looked my way before suddenly offered nods, even handshakes. Journalists circled, some with microphones poised for statements, but Rachel handled them with her usual blend of steel and grace. fielding questions as she steered us through the crowd. I found myself hugging her, tight and fierce. "Thank you," I whispered, though the words felt anemic for all she'd done. She simply smiled, her eyes softening. "You did this," she said. "I just made sure they listened." Those words sank into me and glowed, deep and true. For all the help I'd received, I'd never fully abandoned myself, my fight, or the love that had fueled every solitary night. The ride home was a blur. My phone was flooded with messages, some from people who had drifted away when things got hard, others who had seen the news online, even old friends who wanted to apologize for believing Tom's story. Part of me wanted to ignore them all, to preserve this fragile peace for just Sophie and me. But I realized that this win was bigger than my private relief. It was, in some ways, a small, blazing torch for anyone who'd ever been wronged and pushed aside, who'd clung to hope when all the odds mocked them. Arriving at the apartment, I was struck by how untouched everything looked. The same scuffed floorboards, the sunflower stickers on Sophie's door, a line of her books gathering dust along the bottom shelf. The apartment hadn't changed, but everything inside me had. I walked from room to room, opening the blinds to let in every slant of daylight. I fluffed up Sophie's pillows, unfolded her favorite blanket, and arranged her soft toys just the way she liked them. The simple rituals felt sacred, a way of telling the universe I was ready for her to come home. The hours waiting for the official transfer crept by in a strange, jittery daze. I cleaned and recleaned, reheated soup and let it go cold, sitting sometimes in the quiet, sometimes at the window watching for the car. That would bring Sophie back. My hands shook with anticipation, and doubts still darted in like moths. Would Sophie blame me for the time we'd lost? Would she even recognize the mother I'd become? I'd spent so long learning to guard every word and feeling that the thought of simply letting love out again was both exhilarating and terrifying. The knock finally came just after dusk. I froze, then scrambled so quickly I nearly tripped over my own feet. Rachel arrived with the child services representative, both determinedly businesslike, but with gentle eyes. And then there was Sophie, clutching a worn-out stuffed rabbit, her hair longer, her cheeks a little thinner. For a heartbeat, time frayed at the edges. Then she ran to me, and I dropped to my knees. Familiar arms thundered around my neck, her small shoulders racked with sobs against mine, as though she'd been holding herself together for months, just waiting for a signal she could finally let go. We held each other for what must have been 10 minutes, but it felt like no time at all. I breathed in the scent of her, honeyed shampoo and laundromat softener, the salty sharpness of tears. "I missed you, Mommy," she whispered into my ear, and I realized I'd worried for nothing. That bond, nearly choked by separation, had survived undiminished. I told her the truth, simply and quietly. I never stopped loving you. I never stopped believing. That first night back together, we curled up on the couch with her head on my lap. She traced the lines on my palm, recounting little snippets of life at Tom's. What she liked, what she secretly hated, what scared her. I listened. I whispered back secrets of my own. Not the bitterness, never the accusations, but the stories of hope. The nights I stared at her photo and promised myself we'd see this through. We laughed. We cried. We rebuilt our private world, brick by emotional brick. I expected the city to remain indifferent, but word travels fast. My lease manager, once cool and formal, knocked on my door a few days later to say congratulations. At the grocery store, a cashier who'd always eyed me dubiously now smiled, slipped a chocolate bar into Sophie's hand on the house. Even my boss at the dental clinic gave me a cautious nod and said he'd followed the case in the news. And maybe we all owe you an apology, Emily. Forgiveness was uneven. Some people never looked me in the eye again, clinging to their judgments. But little by little, the poison that had tainted my reputation began to clear. Kids from Sophie's school started coming over again, and their parents, with awkward hugs and hesitant words, joined them. I understood. People love a comeback story, and even the most closed hearts soften at the proof of a mother's faith. The adjustment wasn't perfect or instant. Sophie carried anxieties, sometimes waking at night calling for me, sometimes silent at the dinner table as she processed everything she'd been through. I learned to be patient. That love, even when hard won, needed gentle room to breathe. We started seeing a therapist together. On weekends, we planted flowers outside the apartment, coaxing them to bloom as a kind of private metaphor. Roots deepening, petals brightening against the odds. Rachel remained in our lives, first as my legal rock, then as a friend. She stopped by when she could, always bringing something small for Sophie. A book, a silly sticker, a puzzle. I realized over time that she hadn't just handed me a victory. She'd modeled what resilience looked like for both of us. I tried to pay that forward, volunteering with parent groups, quietly reaching out to others I recognized at the courthouse. People with haunted eyes and battered hope. If I could help even one other mother facing the lonely machinery of the system, it seemed like a fitting return for all the grace I'd been shown. Slowly, rituals once filled with sadness grew sweet again. Afternoons meant baking cookies with flour on our noses, evening bike rides past the old sycamores, with Sophie's laughter in the wind, her legs pumping furiously. On weekends, we discovered the city together anew. Museums, playgrounds, the zoo. Sometimes we just sprawled in bed reading until noon, Sophie's foot hooked over my hip, as if daring the world to pry us apart again. Our apartment became a witness to new beginnings. Walls once echoing with emptiness, now vibrant with art projects, handprints, and the unrestrained joy of a child setting down her fears. Sophie's room slowly blossomed with stickers, posters, and strings of lights. I let her choose new sheets, new paint samples, every act a tiny stake of ownership and hope. One night, as I was tucking Sophie in, she studied my face with that unnerving seriousness children possess. "Mommy, are you going to leave again?" It was a dagger, but I braced myself and answered truthfully, "I will never leave you, not by choice. And if we ever have trouble again, we'll fight together. I promise." She nodded, satisfied. That trust, painfully restored, mattered more than any legal victory. Sometimes, what strikes me most is the contrast. How the world measures mothers, weighs them for faults and stumbles, but so rarely sees the quiet heroism of waking up, showing up, telling the truth when no one wants to hear it. I know I'm not perfect. I never was, and I never will be. But I am enough. Being Sophie's mother again, free from accusation, is the greatest proof of that. It's funny. Honor, in the traditional sense, always seemed like such an outdated concept, something belonging to knights or politicians. But real honor, I see now, is the willingness to stand in the fire for what matters, to keep loving when it would be easier to give up, to forgive yourself when the world won't. My name is still whispered sometimes, in the aisles, but now, just as often, it is spoken with admiration. She didn't quit. She fought for her child. That's a legacy I can live with. We've found our way back to laughter, to late-night popcorn, and mornings when the sun catches in Sophie's hair. And I remember exactly what I was fighting for. Sometimes she asks me, "Do you think we're safe now?" I hug her and say yes, and in my heart, believe it more each passing day. Justice, once so far outside my reach, is now a quiet companion, not a distant longing. Sophie and I are more than survivors. We are proof that light can filter even into the darkest rooms, if only you hold out a hand for it long enough. Most of all, I have learned that no matter how battered, a mother's love, stubborn, quiet, relentless, is always enough to tip the scales. Our journey does not end here. It continues, shaped by resilience, colored by hope, forever illuminated by the bond they tried and failed to break.